The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October of 1865, carried by a male coach driver who looked almost embarrassed to deliver it, as though the envelope itself were a burden he was glad to set down. Lenora Whitfield stood on the porch of her brother's farmhouse outside Whitesburg, Kentucky, turning the yellowed paper in her work-roughened hands while the maple trees along the fence line blazed copper and scarlet against a sky the color of hammered steel. A cold wind moved down from the ridgeline, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and the faint mineral scent of the creek that ran along the bottom of the property. Somewhere in the barn, a cow lowed, and the sound echoed across the yard, with the hollow clarity that comes when the air is still and cold, and the world has begun to empty itself for winter. She was 31 years old, a widow for 3 years now since the morning a telegram arrived telling her that Thomas, her husband, her best friend, the father of her daughter, had fallen at Antietam with a Confederate bullet in his chest. 20 feet from the field hospital, they said. 20 feet from safety. He had crawled most of the way, dragging himself through mud and blood and the bodies of other men's husbands, other women's sons. 20 feet. As if that detail were supposed to comfort her, as if knowing how close he had come to surviving made the loss easier to bear. It did not. Her daughter Cordelia stood beside her on the porch, 7 years old with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. And the child they called Cora watched her mother's face the way children do when they sense something important is happening, but cannot yet name what it is. She had learned in her 7 years to read the subtle shifts in her mother's expression. The tightening around the eyes that meant worry, the softening of the mouth that meant memory, the particular stillness that meant her mother was thinking thoughts too large for words. The return address bore the name of a lawyer in Lexington whom Lenora had never met. Inside, written in a clerkish hand on good cotton paper, the letter informed her that her great-aunt Miriam Whitfield, a woman Lenora had seen exactly twice in her 31 years of life, had died without husband or children in the first week of September, and had left the entirety of her earthly estate to her youngest great-niece. And the estate consisted of one thing: a played-out tin mine on 40 acres of rocky hillside in Harlan County, deep in the southeastern hills where Kentucky crumpled against the Virginia border like a fist closing around something it refused to release. Lenora read the letter twice. She folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it in the pocket of her apron. Then she stood on the porch for a long while, watching the light change on the hills, and said nothing to anyone. The wind picked up, carrying with it the first real bite of approaching winter, and still she stood there, her hand resting unconsciously on Cora's shoulder, her mind traveling to places she had never been. Aunt Miriam. She remembered the woman only vaguely. Twice they had met, both times at family gatherings when Lenora was a child. A tall woman, angular, with eyes that seemed to see things other people missed. She had not spoken much, had not smiled much either. But Lenora remembered the way Aunt Miriam had looked at her across the crowded room at her grandmother's funeral, had held her gaze for a long moment, as if recognizing something, as if seeing something that others could not see. And now this, an inheritance, a hole in the ground, Phineas would call it, a worthless legacy from a peculiar woman. But Lenora's father had taught her that nothing was worthless until you understood what it truly was. Her brother Phineas found out that evening. Phineas had a way of finding things out. He was the kind of man who treated information as currency, and he kept careful accounts. He sat at the head of the supper table, his table in his house, a fact his posture never let anyone forget, and with his wife Prudence beside him, her mouth drawn tight as a purse string. The kitchen was warm from the fire and filled with the smell of salt pork and cornbread, but there was a coldness at that table that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Phineas read the letter aloud to the assembled family in a voice that started with curiosity and ended somewhere between pity and contempt. "A mine," Phineas said, setting the paper down on the table like it was a dead thing. He touched it with one finger as though testing whether it might still move. An empty mine. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants everyone to see his disappointment. Aunt Miriam always was peculiar, living alone on that mountain for 40 years, never married, never had children, never did anything sensible with her life. Peculiar. Prudence added, not looking up from her plate. She had a way of delivering her opinions sideways, like a cat that walks past you and happens to leave a scratch. A woman who lives alone on a mountain for 40 years and leaves a hole in the ground to the one relative who can least afford to refuse it. She glanced at Lenora with an expression that might have been sympathy, but felt more like satisfaction. Poor dear, as if you did not have enough troubles already. Dr. Aldous Mercer, a guest at supper that evening, cleared his throat with the authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. He was the physician for 3 counties, a position that granted him opinions on everything from childbirth to architecture to the proper way to slaughter a hog. His hair was gray at the temples, his waistcoat was always buttoned correctly, and he had never in anyone's memory admitted to being wrong about anything. "I have heard about that property," he said, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin. "No scientific basis for anyone surviving up there through winter. The elevation alone would be dangerous. And mine air," he shook his head with the gravity of certain knowledge. "Mine air is toxic. Poisonous gases collect in underground spaces. It is well documented. The Romans wrote about it. Miners die from it every year." Reverend Josiah Crane, who had stopped by to discuss Sunday's hymn selections and stayed for supper, as he often did, nodded solemnly. He was a thin man with a thin voice and a way of making everything sound like a warning from the pulpit. "Living in the earth like an animal is not the Lord's way for his children. We were made to walk upon the ground, not beneath it." Aunt Miriam was, God rest her soul, an eccentric woman. Perhaps, he added delicately, touched in her mind. Lenora looked at her daughter across the table. Cora was watching her with those dark eyes, waiting, not asking questions, not fidgeting, just watching, with the patience that children develop when they learn that the adults around them cannot always be trusted to make good decisions. The fire in the hearth popped and settled, the clock on the mantel, a cheap tin case thing that ran fast by 3 minutes a day, ticked with the nervous insistence of something trying to hurry time along. Lenora had lived in Phineas's house for 3 years now. 3 years since Thomas died. 3 years since the telegram that had broken the world into before and after. She slept in the small room above the kitchen where the heat rose through the floorboards, and the mice ran in the walls at night, their tiny feet scratching patterns in the darkness. She worked Phineas's fields from March to November, her hands growing calloused and strong, her back learning the particular ache of labor that is never acknowledged and never compensated. She ate Phineas's food. She wore clothes that Prudence had decided were too worn for her own use. She owned 2 sets of clothes, a shelf of books that Thomas had left her, and a toolkit her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Her father, a clockmaker from Cornwall, England, who had crossed an ocean with nothing but his tools and his knowledge, who had built a life in this strange new country through the precise application of skill and patience, who had taught her things that no one in this room would believe a woman could understand. Gears and leverage, the mathematics of pressure and temperature, the way metal expands and contracts with heat and cold, the principles of thermodynamics, though he never used that word. He called it understanding how the world wants to move. Stone does not lie, he used to tell her, his hands steady as the mechanisms he built. Stone holds heat, holds cold, holds secrets. Water follows the paths that stone allows. Air moves where pressure permits. Whoever understands these things, whoever learns to read what stone and water and air are telling them, will never be helpless, will never freeze to death, will never be at the mercy of a world they do not comprehend. She remembered sitting in his workshop as a girl, watching him work, and asking questions that he always answered seriously, never dismissing her curiosity because she was female. "Your mind is as good as any man's," he had told her once. "Better than most I have met. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." "I will go look at it," Lenora said quietly. The table fell silent. Phineas set down his fork. Prudence's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Even Dr. Mercer paused mid-chew. Phineas shook his head with the slow deliberation of a man who has been proven right so many times that the gesture has become reflexive. "You will waste a week's travel to look at a worthless hole, a widow with a child, alone on a mountain in winter." He leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands as if presenting obvious evidence. "That is your inheritance, little sister. A hole, An empty, useless, dangerous hole. Prudence laughed. It was not a kind sound. It had edges. It was the laugh of a woman who had learned to find pleasure in the failures of others, because she had so few pleasures of her own. Lenora did not answer. She finished her supper in silence, washed her plate in the basin, dried it, and set it in its place on the shelf. She climbed the stairs to her room, where Cora was already waiting, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed they shared, listening to the wind moving through the bare branches outside the window. The room was cold. It was always cold. The heat from the kitchen below rose unevenly, warming the center of the floor, but leaving the corners chill, and the window panes were rimed with condensation that would freeze by morning. From the shelf above the bed, she took down a copy of James Dwight Dana's Manual of Geology that Thomas had given her the first year of their marriage. She held it in her lap without opening it. The book's spine was cracked from rereading. Its margins were filled with her small, precise handwriting, notes and questions and observations accumulated over years of study. In the darkness, Cora's voice came small and clear. "Mama, are we going to the mountain?" Lenora was quiet for a long moment. Through the floorboards, she could hear the murmur of voices from below. Phineas and Prudence, no doubt, discussing her foolishness. Dr. Mercer offering his expert opinion on the inadvisability of her plan. Reverend Crane suggesting prayers for her troubled mind. "Yes," she said finally, "we are going to the mountain." "And they will see," Cora said. It was not a question. It was a statement of faith, offered by a 7-year-old who had already learned that her mother was different from other people, that her mother saw things that others missed, that her mother's quiet confidence was not stubbornness, but something deeper, something that came from a place of knowing. Lenora smiled in the darkness where no one could see. "Yes, little one, they will see." They left 3 days later, on a Friday morning before dawn, with a borrowed mule, a bedroll, a cast-iron skillet, a tin coffee pot, and enough dried provisions for a week. Lenora had packed carefully, choosing each item for its utility, its weight, its necessity. She had learned economy in the 3 years since Thomas died, had learned that everything you carry must earn its place. Phineas did not come out to see them off. His absence was a statement, and they both understood what it said. Prudence stood in the doorway in her nightdress, her arms crossed against the pre-dawn chill, her face unreadable in the gray light. "You are making a mistake," Prudence said. Her voice held no malice now, only the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "You will be back within a month. Probably less. And when you return, do not expect a warm welcome." Lenora lifted Cora onto the mule's back and checked the girth strap one final time. The animal was patient, accustomed to burdens, and it stood quietly while she adjusted the pack saddle. "Perhaps," Lenora said, "but it will be my mistake." She did not look back as they started down the frozen lane. The stars were still visible overhead, fading slowly as the eastern sky began to lighten. Cora leaned against her mother's back, already drowsing, and the mule's hooves made soft sounds in the frost. The journey to Harlan County took 5 days by mule and foot. Each day carried them deeper into a landscape that seemed to be folding in on itself, withdrawing from the settled world of farms and fences into something older and wilder. Ridge after ridge of sandstone and shale rose and fell, like the frozen waves of a sea turned to stone, each crest revealing another valley, another climb, another horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. The roads, such as they were, narrowed to tracks and then to bare suggestions, faint lines worn into the leaf litter by the passage of deer and the occasional hunter. Twice they passed the remains of old cabins, their roofs fallen in, their walls returning to the earth that had grown the trees from which they were built. People had tried to live here once, had failed, had moved on or died. The trees closed overhead as they climbed higher, oak and hickory and the last stubborn beeches still holding their papery brown leaves. Tulip poplars straight as masts rose 80 feet before the first branch, their bark gray and furrowed, their crowns lost in the canopy above. Everywhere the understory grew thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel, green even in October, their glossy leaves catching what light filtered down from above. The air thinned and sharpened with altitude. Lenora felt it in her lungs, felt the way each breath required slightly more effort than the last. At night, they camped beside creeks that ran clear and cold over beds of smooth stone, and the stars overhead seemed closer than they had any right to be. Not distant points of light, but near presences, watching, bearing witness. Lenora built small fires, cooked their provisions, drank coffee from the tin pot, and read Dana by firelight while Cora slept. The book's familiar weight was a comfort. Its pages held knowledge that no one could take from her. She studied the sections on limestone, on karst topography, on the formation of caves. She made notes in the margins. She thought about what she might find. She slept soundly on beds of hemlock boughs, wrapped in her blanket with Cora pressed against her side, and woke to mornings so cold and bright that the world seemed made of glass. On the third day, they stopped at a crossroads store for coffee beans and lard. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes, studied them with the neutral curiosity of someone who lived at the edge of things and had learned not to ask questions that were not his business. But he looked at Lenora for a long moment when she paid, and she saw something in his face that might have been pity. Two women alone, his expression said, going deeper into the hills. Foolishness. Lenora met his gaze steadily until he looked away. On the fourth day, they passed a farmstead in a narrow valley where a woman hanging laundry watched them from the yard but did not wave her call. The woman's face was weathered, her shoulders bent from years of labor, and she looked at Lenora the way you look at someone walking toward a cliff, wanting to warn them, knowing they would not listen. On the fifth day, they found old Ezra Boone. He was sitting on a stump beside a creek, whittling a piece of cedar into something that might have been a bird or a prayer. His face was weathered to the color and texture of old leather, seamed and creased by 78 years of sun and wind and cold. His hands, though gnarled, moved with the precise economy of long practice, and the shavings fell in thin curls around his feet. He did not look up when they approached, did not acknowledge their presence until Lenora spoke. "Miriam Whitfield's place," she said. Old Ezra squinted at her for a long moment, his knife pausing mid-stroke. His eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear in that weathered face, studied her with the attention of someone who has learned that strangers in these hills usually mean trouble. "Up Beech Fork," he said finally. "Maybe 3 miles past the laurel thicket. Follow the creek. You will see the bluff." He paused, the knife resuming its steady motion. "You family?" "Great niece." He nodded slowly, turning the cedar in his hands, shaving away another thin curl. "She was a quiet one, Miriam. Lived up there 40 years by herself. I do not think she said 100 words to any person in this valley the whole time." He studied Lenora with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been curiosity, or might have been simply the accumulated wisdom of someone who has seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. Bought nothing but lamp oil and blasting powder. Never asked for help, never offered any, kept to herself like she had secrets worth keeping. "What did she find up there?" Lenora asked. Old Ezra was silent for a long moment. The creek murmured beside them, its voice steady and patient. A crow called from somewhere up the hollow, and then another answered. "Once," he said finally, "I asked her that very question. She had come down to the store for supplies, which she did maybe twice a year, no more. Most solitary woman I ever knew. And I asked her, 'Miriam, what have you got up there that keeps you so content? What is worth 40 years alone on that mountain?'" He paused, his eyes distant, remembering. She just smiled. First time I ever saw her smile. And she said, "What people spend their whole lives looking for, without knowing it, is right beneath their feet." He looked at Cora, perched on the mule, watching him with solemn eyes. "Ain't much up there now," he said. "Mine's been empty since before anyone can remember. Just an old cabin and a hole in the ground." "I will have a look anyway," Lenora said. Old Ezra shrugged and went back to his whittling. "Your mule," he said. And then, softer, almost to himself, "Your choice." They found the mine on the afternoon of the fifth day, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridgeline, casting long shadows through the trees. The 40 acres occupied the western face of a steep wooded hollow where the hills came together like cupped hands. Beech Fork ran along the base, a clear, cold stream barely 6 feet wide that murmured over a bed of water-smoothed limestone cobbles. The sound of the water was constant, a voice that had been speaking for thousands of years and would continue speaking long after everyone who heard it now was gone. The slopes above were dense with hemlock and poplar and oak, the canopy high enough to create a sense of enclosure. A room made of trees. The air here was different, cooler, damper, carrying a mineral scent that Lenora recognized from her father's descriptions of the tin mines of Cornwall. The mine entrance was halfway up the slope, a dark rectangular mouth cut into a limestone bluff that rose 30 feet above the creek bottom, the stone face weathered and stained by centuries of water seepage. Virginia creeper, gone crimson in the autumn chill, hung in curtains across the opening, and a seep of water darkened the stone below like a stain. The entrance looked like a wound in the hillside, or like a mouth frozen in the middle of a word. A small cabin, more shack than house but built with a solidity that suggested competence, if not ambition, stood 30 yards below the entrance on a small bench of level ground. Its roof sagged under the weight of accumulated leaves and the slow surrender of decades. Its single window was shuttered with warped boards. A stone chimney rose from one end, still intact, mortared with lime that had held against decades of weather. Someone had lived here, had built something here, had stayed for 40 years, alone. Lenora tied the mule to a cedar post, loosened the girth on its pack saddle, and stood looking at the mine entrance for a long time. The air coming from within was cool and faintly damp, carrying a mineral smell that was not unpleasant. Clean, ancient, like the earth's own slow exhalation. She could hear water somewhere inside, a distant trickling that echoed softly off unseen walls. The sound was not lonely exactly, it was patient. It had been making that sound for a very long time, and was in no hurry to stop. Then Cora said, "Mama, look." A dog was lying on the cabin's porch, a border collie, a black and white, its coat matted and its ribs showing through its skin. It raised its head when they approached, too weak to stand, and its eyes, amber brown and intelligent, fixed on Lenora with an expression she would never forget. It was not pleading. It was not afraid. It was waiting, as though it had been waiting for a very long time, and had finally been found. Lenora knelt beside it. The dog's tail moved once, twice, a feeble wag that used the last of its strength. Its eyes did not leave her face. Cora crouched beside her mother. "Is it dying?" "No," Lenora said, though she was not entirely certain. "Not if we can help it." She ran her hand over the dog's head, feeling the bones beneath the fur. How long had it been here? Since Miriam died, at least. Weeks, possibly months. And waiting on this porch for someone who would never return? "He was waiting for Aunt Miriam to come back," Cora said softly. "He did not know she was not coming back." "Then he will wait for us now," Lenora said. They named him Scout. Over the following days, as Lenora worked to make the cabin habitable, Scout grew stronger. Cora fed him small pieces of dried meat, first by hand, then from a bowl. He began to stand, to walk, to follow them from room to room with the devoted attention of an animal that has learned what loyalty costs and chosen it anyway. He had been Miriam's companion, Lenora realized, her only companion for years, and he had stayed, even after she was gone, even when no one came, even when staying meant starvation. That kind of faithfulness, Lenora thought, deserved to be honored. The cabin took 3 days to make habitable. Lenora worked with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that preparation was not delay, but foundation. She patched the roof with bark shingles split from a fallen chestnut, laying them in overlapping courses the way her father had taught her, each shingle positioned to shed water to the one below. She re-chinked the walls with fresh lime mortar, mixed from limestone she crushed with a hand maul and slaked in water from the creek. The lime burned her hands when she worked it, leaving her skin raw and cracked. But the walls needed to be sealed against the winter that was coming. She cleared the chimney of a bird's nest built by some creature long since departed, reaching up into the flue and pulling down handfuls of twigs and dried grass and the desiccated remains of insects. She tested the door on its leather hinges and found them cracked but functional. She cleared the gutter trench that Miriam had dug around the cabin's uphill side to divert rainwater. The cabin was rough but sound beneath its neglect. Miriam had built well. The walls were hand-hewn poplar logs, each one squared with an adze and fitted so tightly that the chinking between them was almost decorative. The floor was packed earth, dry and level, tamped to the hardness of fired clay. A stone hearth dominated the west wall, blackened from decades of fires, its firebox deep and well-drafted. Cora helped where she could, carrying water, sweeping leaves, providing the kind of company that does not require conversation. She talked to Scout constantly, telling him stories, explaining what her mother was doing, and asking him questions that he answered with the tilt of his head or the wag of his tail. By the third evening, a fire burned in the hearth, and the cabin, which had felt abandoned hours before, began to feel like what it had once been. A shelter, a place where someone could sit and think and be warm. On the morning of the fourth day, Lenora lit one of the oil lamps she had brought from Whitesburg, trimmed the wick until the flame burned steady and bright, and walked into the mine. Scout came with her. He moved with more confidence now, though his ribs still showed, and he stayed close to her side as they entered the darkness together. The entrance tunnel was approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, short at intervals with oak timbers that had darkened with age to the color of old iron, but remained solid. The grain was tight. Half the surfaces were hard enough to turn a fingernail. Whoever had cut these timbers had known what they were doing, had chosen the wood carefully, had set them to last. The floor was relatively smooth, worn by years of foot traffic and the passage of small ore carts whose iron wheel tracks were still visible as shallow grooves in the stone. The walls showed the marks of hand drilling and black powder blasting, rough irregular surfaces of gray limestone streaked with darker bands of shale. Here and there, thin seams of calcite glinted white in the lamplight, like veins in living stone. Lenora moved slowly, holding the lamp high, letting her eyes adjust to the subterranean dark. She noted everything: the angle of the walls, the composition of the stone, the way water seeped through certain sections and left others dry. She understood the basic structure of what she was seeing. The mine followed a vein of cassiterite, tin ore, that ran roughly northeast through the limestone. The vein had been worked for perhaps a quarter mile, with side drifts branching off at intervals where the miners had followed subsidiary deposits into the rock. Most of these drifts ended in blank walls where the ore had petered out, the miners' disappointment almost palpable in the abruptness with which the digging stopped. But the ore was not what interested her. The temperature was what interested her. After perhaps 200 yards, the air felt noticeably warmer than the October chill outside. Her breath, which had fogged at the entrance, became invisible. She paused and held her hand flat against the limestone wall. It was not warm exactly, but it was not cold. It held a neutrality, a constancy that felt almost alive, as though the stone itself were maintaining a temperature by some quiet act of will. She noted this in the leather journal she had brought. Air temperature approximately 56 to 58 degrees at 200 yards depth. Wall temperature consistent. No draft from ahead. Slight air movement from behind. Chimney effect from temperature differential with outside air. The main tunnel continued for roughly a quarter mile, descending gently before ending in a partial collapse. A jumble of broken rock and shattered timbers blocked further progress. The collapse looked old. Dust had settled over the debris in a thick, undisturbed layer. Water seeped through the rubble, running in a thin sheet across the floor and disappearing into a crack along the base of the wall with a soft, persistent murmur. But it was not the collapse that stopped Lenora's breath. It was the door. Set into the left wall of the tunnel, perhaps 30 feet before the collapse, was a wooden door. Not a mine door, not the rough plank barriers that miners use to direct airflow through tunnels, but a proper door made of thick oak planks, darkened almost to black with age and mineral deposits. Iron strap hinges, heavy and hand-forged, held it to a frame set directly into the limestone. Someone had chiseled a precise rectangular recess into the living rock and fitted the frame into it with the care of a cabinet maker setting a door in a fine house. A padlock, massive, rusted, its keyhole packed with mineral crust, secured the hasp. Lenora stood before it with the lamp raised, her shadow thrown long and wavering against the tunnel wall behind her. A scout sat beside her, utterly still, his amber eyes fixed on the door, with an intensity that suggested he had been here before. that he knew what lay beyond. The door was not part of the mine's working structure. The timbers around it were different, older, more carefully shaped, their surfaces smoothed in a way that suggested not just utility, but intention. Someone had built this door to last, and they had built it to keep something sealed. She pressed her ear against the wood. Beyond it, she heard, or believed she heard, a faint movement of air. Not wind exactly, a breathing, slow and rhythmic, a subtle pulse of pressure that came and went with a cadence that seemed almost biological, as if the mountain itself were inhaling and exhaling through whatever lay behind this door. She stood there for a long time, her heart beating against her ribs, her mind racing through possibilities. Then she turned and walked back out into the daylight, blinking against the brightness, carrying with her the image of the dark sealed rectangle, like a question that had lodged itself behind her eyes. Now I want you to pause for just a moment. Imagine yourself standing where Lenora stood, a sealed door in an abandoned mine, something breathing behind it, something no one has seen in 70 years. What would you do? Would you open it? Would you walk away? Would you tell anyone what you had found? Think about that as we continue. It took her 2 days to break the padlock. She fashioned a pry bar from a piece of iron strapping she found in the mine's refuse pile, a discarded section of ore cart rail. She heated it in her hearth fire until it glowed cherry red, and hammered it on a flat rock into a curved lever. The work was slow. Her arms ached. Her hands blistered and bled. But she did not stop. The hasp was the weak point. The screws that held it to the door frame had corroded in the damp air, and the wood around them had softened over decades. On her fourth attempt, the hasp tore free with a groan that echoed down the tunnel like a voice from another era, like something waking after a long sleep. She swung the door inward. Its hinges protested, a long, grinding shriek that faded into an echo traveling impossibly far into the space beyond. The air that met her was warm. Not the neutral coolness of the mine tunnel, but genuinely, unmistakably warm. She estimated 57 or 58 degrees, though against her chilled October skin, it felt almost tropical. It carried a different smell, a cleaner, wetter, with a faint mineral sweetness like rain on hot limestone. And it moved. The air flowed past her in a steady, gentle current, as if the space beyond were breathing out through this newly opened mouth. Cora stood behind her, holding Scout by the scruff of his neck, her dark eyes wide. "Mama," she whispered. "What is it?" Lenora stepped through the doorway and raised her lamp. The chamber was enormous. Her lamplight could not reach the ceiling or the far walls. It simply dissolved into darkness above and ahead, swallowed by a space that felt immense in the way a cathedral feels immense. Not just large, but intentionally grand, as if the darkness itself were architecture. The lamp flame flickered in the moving air, sending shadows swinging across the nearest surfaces, and each swing revealed new details. Curved walls, hanging shapes, the glint of something that caught the light and threw it back in fragments. The floor sloped gently downward, covered in a layer of cave clay so smooth and fine it might have been laid by human hands. But no human hand had touched this place. Water had shaped it. Millions of years of water, patient and relentless, dissolving the limestone atom by atom, carrying it away in solution, leaving behind these soaring vaults as a record of its passage. After perhaps 100 yards, the passage opened further, and Lenora stopped. The chamber before her was roughly circular, perhaps 80 feet across and 40 feet high. A shallow pool of water covered its center, still as glass, reflecting her lamplight in a wavering golden disk. The water was clear enough that she could see the clay bottom 4 or 5 feet below, where small calcite formations grew like a miniature garden of white stone, and rising from the edges of the pool, climbing the walls in clustered formations, covering every visible surface in a glittering crust. Crystals, thousands of them, tens of thousands. They ranged in size from the tip of her little finger to the length of her forearm. They were translucent, faintly honey-colored, with a vitreous luster that caught the lamplight and shattered it into 10,000 points of fire. The walls seemed to burn with a cold, steady flame. They grew in clusters and rosettes, in blade-like sheets and stubby hexagonal prisms, in formations that branched and interlocked, with a complexity that was at once mathematical and wild. They covered the chamber like the interior of a geode scaled to the dimensions of a room. A room built by geology for no audience and no purpose. Perfect and complete and entirely indifferent to whether anyone ever saw it. Cora stepped past her mother and stood at the edge of the pool, her face tilted upward, her mouth open in wordless wonder. "Mama," she breathed, "it is the Fairy Queen's castle." Behind them, Scout padded into the chamber. He stopped, sniffed the air, and then, for the first time since they had found him starving on the cabin porch, his tail began to wag. Slowly at first, then faster, sweeping back and forth with the unmistakable rhythm of joy. He knew this place. He had been here before, with Miriam. Lenora set the lamp on a flat rock and sat down on the clay floor. She sat there for a long time, turning slowly, letting her eyes adjust to the scale of what surrounded her. Her hands were trembling. Not from cold, but from the particular tremor that comes when the mind encounters something it has imagined in theory and finds manifested in fact. She recognized the crystals. They were calcite, calcium carbonate, formed as mineral-rich water seeped through the limestone and entered the cave, where slight changes in temperature and pressure caused the dissolved mineral to precipitate, molecule by molecule, building crystal upon crystal in lattice structures governed by the geometry of atomic bonds. The honey color came from trace iron oxide. The size of the formation suggested that this chamber had been sealed from the surface for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands. The crystals had grown undisturbed in conditions of perfect stability. She understood now why Aunt Miriam had sealed the door. Not to hide the cave, but to protect it, to preserve the conditions that had created this place and that would continue creating it, crystal by crystal, century by century, as long as no careless hand disturbed the balance. Lenora reached out and touched the wall beside her. The crystals were cool and smooth, hard as glass. She did not break one. She did not consider it. That night in the cabin, with Cora asleep in the narrow bed and Scout curled at their feet, Lenora found Aunt Miriam's journal. It was on a shelf beside the fireplace, swollen with damp but still partially legible. The early pages had fused together, the ink blurred beyond recognition. But the later entries, written in a small, careful hand, could still be read. March 15, 1831. I have found it, more beautiful than anything I have ever seen, and I understand now that it does not belong to me. It belongs to time. My task is only to protect it. December 7th, 1847, winter 16. The house is warm, the mountain breeze for me. February 2nd, 1859. They say I am mad. A woman alone on a mountain for 30 years. Let them say it. They do not know what I know. They have not seen what I have seen. September 3rd, 1865. I am dying. I feel it in my bones. The mountain will keep breathing after I am gone. Someone will come. Someone who understands. The door will wait. Lenora closed the journal and held it against her chest. The mountain breeze for me. She thought about the steady warmth in the cave. 57 degrees year-round, regardless of the weather above. She thought about the air flowing out through the newly opened door. I'm pushed by the slight pressure differential between the constant temperature underground and the changing temperatures on the surface. She thought about her father's hands, showing her how to measure, how to calculate, how to build systems that worked with nature rather than against it. Stone holds heat, stone holds cold, stone holds secrets. An idea began to form, not fully shaped, but present. A seed in dark soil, waiting for the conditions that would let it grow. By the end of November, the hollow was locked in the gray grip of early winter. Frost rimed the cabin windows each morning, thick enough to scrape with a fingernail, and ice formed at the edges of the creek, spreading a little further each day like white fingers reaching toward the center of the current. Lenora worked. She had conceived of a system that would have seemed impossible to anyone who saw only its parts and not its whole. A breathing channel, she called it in her journal. A wooden duct of split poplar boards, roughly 8 inches square, sealed at the joints with pine pitch mixed with beeswax. It would run from a vent cut near the sealed door, where warm air flowed most strongly, through the mine entrance, along a shallow trench in the slope, and into the cabin through a hole in the foundation logs. The total run was approximately 40 yards. The exterior would be wrapped in dried leaves packed between the duct and an outer bark shell for insulation. The principle was simple, though its execution was anything but. Warm air rises. At 57 degrees, the cave air was vastly warmer than the outside air in winter. The duct would create a natural convection current, a thermosiphon. Warm air would flow into the cabin, rise toward the ceiling, displace the cooler air, which would exit through normal gaps in the structure. No fan, no bellows, no fuel consumed beyond what the earth itself provided. The temperature differential was the engine. She worked alone for the most part. Her hands bled from splitting boards. Her shoulders ached from digging the trench. At night, she fell into sleep so deep it was like drowning, and woke before dawn to begin again. Cora helped where she could, holding boards in place, fetching tools, bringing water from the creek. She did not complain. She seemed to understand, with the intuition that children sometimes possess, that what her mother was building mattered, that it was worth the effort, just that it would prove something. Scout followed Lenora everywhere, sitting patiently while she measured and cut and fitted, watching with those amber eyes as if supervising a project he considered of great importance. Sometimes she talked to him while she worked, explaining what she was doing and why. He listened with the attention of a creature who takes everything seriously. The first visitor arrived on a cold morning in late November. Lenora heard the horse before she saw it. She was working on the duct's final connection to the cabin, fitting a sliding damper of oak that would allow her to control the airflow, when the sound of hooves on frozen ground made her look up. A young man sat astride a bay mare, watching her from the edge of the clearing. He was perhaps 22, with a sharp face and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously tested by life. His clothes were good, his horse was well fed, and his expression held the easy contempt of someone who has never had to question whether he deserved his good fortune. "So it is true," he said. "There is a widow up here building something peculiar." Lenora did not stop working. She fitted the damper into its groove, tested its motion, satisfied herself that it slid smoothly. "I am Virgil Tanner," the young man said, when she did not respond, "from down the valley." "Lenora Whitfield," she replied, still not looking up. "What are you building?" "A heating system." Virgil laughed. It was a young man's laugh, full of easy certainty. A heating system, in the ground. He shook his head, still grinning. "The boys in town have a bet going. $5 says you do not survive your first winter up here." He paused, his grin widening. "I put my money on death by February." Lenora finally looked at him. Her eyes, gray-green like the winter sky, held something he could not quite read. Not anger, not hurt. Something deeper. Something that made his smile falter for just a moment. "You will see," she said. It was not a threat. It was not even a challenge. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who has measured the forces involved and found them sufficient. Virgil's smile faltered for just a moment longer. Then he laughed again, turned his horse, and rode back down the mountain. The second visitor came 3 days later. Dr. Aldous Mercer arrived in a buggy, his medical bag beside him on the seat as though he expected to need it. He tied his horse to the cedar post and walked around the cabin, examining the trenches, the ductwork, the strange construction that was beginning to take shape. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said finally, stopping in front of her with his hands clasped behind his back. "I feel obligated to speak to you. As a physician, as a man of science." Lenora was splitting shingles for the outer shell of the duct. She did not pause. "I am listening. What you are doing here has no scientific basis." He spoke with the careful patience of a man explaining something obvious to a child. "Underground air is well known to be toxic. The Romans wrote about it. Miners die from it every year. Poisonous gases collect in enclosed spaces. Carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide. The air in that mine could kill you and your daughter in minutes." Lenora split another shingle. It's clean, precise, the wood parting exactly where she intended. "The cave breathes," she said. "The air moves. Moving air does not collect poison. That is not how science works, Mrs. Whitfield. then science has not spent enough time underground. Dr. Mercer's face reddened. His voice rose slightly. I am trying to help you. You are a widow with a young child. You are building something that cannot possibly work in a place that cannot possibly sustain human life through winter. When you fail, and you will fail, your daughter will pay the price for your stubbornness. Lenora set down her fro and looked at him directly. Her face was calm. Her voice was steady. Dr. Mercer, she said, have you ever spent a winter at 3,000 feet elevation? I do not need to. I have science. Lenora picked up her fro and went back to work. You will see. Watch, she said. Dr. Mercer stood there for a long moment, his mouth working as though trying to find words adequate to his frustration. Then he turned, climbed back into his buggy, and drove away without another word. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told by someone with education, with credentials, with authority, that you were wrong about something you knew in your bones was right? Have you ever had to stand there and take their condescension, knowing that time would prove you correct? If you have, you understand exactly what Lenora was feeling in that moment. And if this story is speaking to you, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments. The visitors continued throughout November and December. Reverend Josiah Crane came on a Sunday afternoon, his black coat buttoned against the cold, his Bible held against his chest like a shield. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, I come to you with pastoral concern. I have prayed on this matter, and I feel called to speak. Living in the earth like this, drawing heat from beneath the ground, it is not natural. It is not the way the Lord intended his children to dwell. We were made to walk upon the earth, not to burrow beneath it like moles. Scout sat at the mine entrance, watching the Reverend with calm alertness. A low growl built in his throat, though he did not move. Reverend, Lenora said, her voice echoing slightly in the tunnel where she was working, the Lord made the mountain. The Lord made the stone that holds heat. The Lord made the laws of physics that cause warm air to rise. I am only using what he created. Reverend Crane was silent for a long moment. His fingers tightened on his Bible. There are those in the congregation, he said finally, who say you are practicing something unholy, drawing breath from the earth like a witch at her cauldron. Then those in the congregation, Lenora said, emerging from the mine entrance with a smear of lime dust on her cheek, should come and see for themselves. There is no witchcraft here, only stone and air and mathematics. She met his eyes steadily. You will see, she said. The Reverend left without another word, but she noticed that he walked quickly and did not look back. By mid-December, the system was complete. The duct ran from the cave through the mine entrance and along the slope to the cabin. The exterior was wrapped in dried leaves and bark for insulation. The sliding damper allowed Lenora to control the airflow. Would the cabin itself had been sealed tighter, gaps chinked, windows reinforced with oiled paper. The first test came on a clear December night, temperature 18 degrees below zero, stars burning like ice crystals in a sky so clear it seemed depthless. Lenora closed the damper on the wood stove. Let the fire die to embers, then to ash, then to nothing. Opened the damper on the breathing channel, and waited. For an hour, nothing seemed to change. Cora huddled under blankets on the bed, Scout pressed against her side, her breath visible in the cold air. Mama, she whispered, I am cold. I know, Lenora said. Wait. Then she felt it, a change in the air. Not dramatic, not sudden, but present. The cold that had been seeping through the walls began to recede. The air itself seemed to warm, degree by degree, as the steady breath of the mountain filled the small space. By midnight, with no fire burning, the cabin held at 50 degrees. Cool but survivable, a temperature that would have required constant feeding of the wood stove to maintain in any normal structure. She rebuilt a small fire, just enough to take the edge off. And by morning, the cabin was holding at 62 degrees with a fraction of the fuel any other house in the region would require. Lenora sat at the small table she had built, writing in her journal by lamplight while Cora still slept. December 15th, 1865. First full test of the breathing channel. Outside temperature, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside temperature maintained, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Firewood consumption. Approximately 1/4 normal. System functions as designed. The mountain breathes. She looked at the words for a long time. Then she added one more line. They will see. Lenora had proven her system worked. 62 degrees inside while 18 below zero raged outside. 1/4 the firewood of any normal cabin. The mountain was breathing for her, just as it had breathed for Aunt Miriam for 40 years. But here's the question. Do you think that was enough to change the minds of those who had called her mad? Do you think Dr. Mercer suddenly believed in science he had dismissed? Do you think Reverend Crane accepted that living in the earth could be holy? The answer might surprise you. Keep watching. In late December, a stranger arrived. He came on foot, carrying a pack, and walking with the purposeful stride of a man who knows where he is going and why. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, and with hands that showed the calluses of heavy work and eyes that held the particular attention of someone accustomed to understanding how things are made. His name was Thaddeus Brennan, and he had come from Pittsburgh looking for tin. The railroad company I work for, he explained, sitting at Lenora's table while she poured coffee from the battered tin pot, needs tin for bearing surfaces. They heard there was an old tin mine somewhere in these hills. I have been walking for 3 weeks, asking questions, following rumors. The mine is empty, Lenora said. Has been for decades. I know. Thaddeus took the coffee and wrapped his hands around the warm cup. I stopped at the store in the valley. They told me about you. What did they tell you? That there is a widow on the mountain building something impossible. That she is either a fool or a witch or both. He smiled slightly. I wanted to see for myself. And what do you see? Thaddeus looked around the cabin. He noted the temperature, warm enough to work in shirt sleeves. He noted the small fire in the wood stove, far too small to account for the warmth. He noted the duct emerging from the floor near the door, the damper lever beside it. I see, he said slowly. Something I have only read about in technical papers from Europe. Thermosiphon heating, drawing warmth from a constant temperature source through natural convection. He looked at her with new interest. His eyes were blue, the clear blue of deep water, and they held no mockery, no condescension, only genuine curiosity. I did not think anyone in America had built one. Lenora felt something shift in her chest. A door she had not known was closed, swinging open. You know what this is? I know the principle. Thaddeus set down his coffee. I am an engineer by training, though I work as a blacksmith now. I have read papers on earth-coupled heating systems. The Swiss have experimented with them in the Alps, the Norwegians, the Icelanders. He looked at the duct with professional appreciation. But I have never seen one actually built. He met her eyes. Where did you learn this? My father, she said. He was a clockmaker from Cornwall. He taught me to think in systems. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the people in the valley say you are mad. They are the ones who are mad. What you have built here is 50 years ahead of its time. He stayed. He said it was to help her prepare the mine for potential future surveying. They both knew that was not the entire truth. He helped her reinforce the duct system, adding a second layer of bark insulation at the points most exposed to weather. He helped her build a proper bed frame for Cora with rope lattice suspension that lifted her off the cold ground. He played with Scout in the snow, throwing sticks that the dog retrieved with joyful abandon. He taught Cora how to whistle through a blade of grass, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to tell direction by the stars. In the evenings, he and Lenora sat by the fire and talked about engineering, about minerals, about the hidden structures of the world that most people never see or think about. He listened when she explained her theories about cave formation and heat transfer. He asked questions that showed he understood what she was saying. He never dismissed her ideas because she was a woman. When he had lost his wife to cholera 3 years earlier, Elizabeth, her name had been. They had been married for 7 years. He understood grief in a way that did not require explanation. Understood the particular loneliness of continuing to live when someone you loved had stopped. And slowly, so slowly, neither of them could have said when it began, something grew between them. Not passion, not the wildfire of youth. Something quieter, more durable. The recognition of two people who had learned to live alone and were discovering they might not have to. Widow Opal Shelton became a regular visitor that winter. She came every week, walking the 3 miles from her small cabin in the valley, bringing whatever she could spare: a jar of preserved apples, a skein of wool, news from the settlement below. She was 45 years old, weathered by 8 years of widowhood and the particular loneliness that comes from being a woman alone in a world that believes women should not be alone. Her husband had died in a logging accident, crushed beneath a falling oak, and she had kept their small farm running by herself ever since. The men in the valley had opinions about that too, just as they had opinions about Lenora. The first time Opal felt the warmth of Lenora's cabin, she stood in the doorway for a full minute, her eyes closed, her face lifted toward the gentle current of air rising from the floor. "It is like standing in sunlight," she said finally, "except the sun is underground." She asked to see the system. Lenora showed her: the duct, the damper, the principle of convection. Opal listened with the focused attention of someone who has learned that knowledge is survival. "I want to build one," she said, "on my property. There is a spring cave behind my barn. The air there is always the same temperature, summer and winter." Lenora looked at this woman who had walked 3 miles in the snow to learn something that every man in the valley had dismissed as madness. "I will teach you," Lenora said. It was the beginning of something, not just a friendship, but a quiet alliance. 2 widows, 2 women who refused to freeze, 2 voices in the wilderness, speaking a language that others could not hear. On a cold morning in January, another visitor came, but this one was different. Cornelius Blackwood arrived in a carriage pulled by matched black horses, the finest vehicle anyone in the hollow had ever seen. And the carriage was lacquered and gilded, with glass windows and velvet curtains and brass fittings that caught the winter sun like mirrors. He wore a wool coat with a fur collar and carried a walking stick topped with silver. His face was smooth and pink and well-fed, the face of a man who had never missed a meal in his life, never slept cold, never wondered where his next dollar would come from. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, not bothering to step down from the carriage, "I have heard about your discovery." Scout stood at Lenora's feet, his hackles raised, his amber eyes fixed on the stranger with undisguised hostility. A low growl built in his throat. "I do not know what you have heard," Lenora said. "I have heard," Blackwood smiled, "but it did not reach his eyes that you have found something remarkable in that old mine, a cave of some kind, and with unusual formations. Crystals, some say." Lenora said nothing. "I am a businessman, Mrs. Whitfield, from Louisville. I acquire properties with potential." He leaned forward in his seat, his smile widening, but his eyes remaining cold. "I am prepared to offer you $500 for your 40 acres. That is 10 times what this land is worth. More money than you could earn in 5 years of honest labor. The land is not for sale." Blackwood's smile did not waver, but something hardened behind his eyes. "Mrs. Whitfield, you are a widow, a woman alone. I see you have taken in a boarder, but legally speaking, you have very limited rights in this county. Property laws here are, shall we say, flexible. I have friends in the courthouse. I could make things very difficult for you. Or," he spread his hands magnanimously, "I could make things very easy. $500, a new start somewhere else, a better life for you and your daughter." Thaddeus stepped forward, his hand closing into a fist, but Lenora put a hand on his arm. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. Her voice was calm. Her eyes were steady. "I appreciate your offer, and your warning, but this land belonged to my aunt, and it belongs to me, and it will belong to my daughter. It is not for sale, not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Blackwood studied her for a long moment. The smile had faded. What remained was something colder, more calculating. "We shall see about that, Mrs. Whitfield. I will buy this property when you fail. And you will fail. Women like you always do." "You will see," Lenora said. Blackwood's carriage rolled away down the frozen track, and then Lenora watched it go with an expression that gave nothing away. The winter deepened. January brought snow that piled higher each week, and temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there. Lenora heard stories from the valley of families burning furniture to stay warm, of livestock freezing in their barns, of the old and the sick succumbing to the relentless cold. In the cabin on the mountain, the breathing channel continued to function. Warm air from the cave, pushed by the temperature differential, flowed steadily into the small space. The fire in the wood stove burned low, supplementing what the mountain provided, but no longer fighting a losing battle against the winter. Cora grew stronger, her cheeks pink with health that had been pale in Phineas's drafty house. The scout's ribs disappeared beneath a coat thick and glossy with good feeding. Thaddeus worked on improvements to the system, modifications that increased its efficiency, and he looked at Lenora with eyes that held something she was learning to recognize. And then one afternoon in late January, disaster struck. Lenora and Thaddeus were deep in the cave, expanding the walkway that would eventually allow visitors to see the crystal chamber safely. They had been working for hours, laying flat stones to create a raised path above the delicate clay floor. Lenora was measuring a section of wall for a lamp bracket when she heard it. A crack. Not loud but deep. The sound of stone shifting in a way that stone was not meant to shift. "Thaddeus," she said, her voice sharp. He looked up from his work, and in that moment, the ceiling fell. Not the whole ceiling. A section perhaps 8 feet across, a shelf of limestone that had been weakened by centuries of water seepage and the vibrations of their hammering. It came down in a roar of dust and debris, and Thaddeus disappeared beneath it. The silence that followed was absolute. Lenora screamed his name. She scrambled over the debris, her hands bleeding on the sharp edges of broken stone. Her lamp dropped and guttering in the dust-thick air. She found him pinned beneath a slab of limestone, his leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach lurch. He was conscious, his face gray with pain, his breath coming in short gasps. "Lenora," he said through gritted teeth. "Get help! I cannot move." She looked at the stone pinning him. 300 pounds at least, perhaps more than she could lift alone. She looked at her daughter, standing at the edge of the cave-in, her face white with terror. "Cora," she said, her voice steady with a calm she did not feel. "Run down to the valley. Find anyone. Tell them there has been an accident. Bring men who can lift." Cora stared at her mother, at Thaddeus trapped beneath the stone, at the blood seeping from the cuts on her mother's hands. "Mama," she whispered. "Run," Lenora said. "Now." Cora ran, and Scout ran with her, keeping pace beside the girl as she raced down the mountain, guiding her along the path they had walked so many times before. What followed was the longest 5 hours of Lenora's life. She could not move the stone alone. She tried. God help her, she tried. She found a piece of oak timber and used it as a lever, pressing down with all her weight, screaming with the effort. The stone shifted perhaps an inch. Not enough to free him, not nearly enough. Thaddeus drifted in and out of consciousness. He murmured her name. He talked about Pittsburgh, about his dead wife Elizabeth, about the railroad job he had left behind. He told her she was beautiful. He told her he was sorry. Lenora held his hand and talked to him. About anything. About nothing. About the crystals glittering in the lamplight around them. About the warmth of the cave that was keeping them both alive. About the life they would build together when this was over. Because it would be over. It had to be over. She would not let him die here, in this place of beauty and wonder, because of her ambition. After 3 hours, she managed to shift the stone far enough to partially free his leg. But the damage was done. She could see it in the unnatural angle of his knee, or in the swelling that had already begun. He would never walk quite right again. When the men from the valley finally arrived, led by Cora and Scout, they found Lenora sitting in the dust beside Thaddeus, holding his hand, her face streaked with tears and lime dust and blood. They lifted the stone. They carried Thaddeus out on a makeshift stretcher, and Lenora walked beside them every step of the way, holding his hand, refusing to let go. He recovered, slowly, painfully, through weeks of fever and infection that nearly killed him, through the careful ministrations of Dr. Aldous Mercer, who came up the mountain despite his skepticism, because he was, underneath everything, a man who believed in healing. The leg healed, though not perfectly. The knee would never bend quite right again. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And when Thaddeus could finally stand, leaning on a crutch, his left leg forever changed by what had happened in the cave. Lenora stood beside him. "I will understand," she said, "if you want to leave. This place nearly killed you." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out with his free hand and touched her face. "This place," he said, "gave me back something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to stay somewhere. A reason to build something. A reason to love someone." He kissed her, there in the cabin doorway, with Scout watching and Cora pretending not to watch and the mountain breathing warm air around them both. Sometimes the people we love nearly lose us to the very things we are trying to build. Sometimes disaster reveals what was always there. If you have ever almost lost someone, if you have ever sat in the darkness holding a hand and praying for more time, then you know what Lenora felt in that cave. Leave a comment if this story is touching something in you. I want to know. The storm came on the 23rd of February in the year 1866. It began like other storms. Snow falling steady through the morning, soft and quiet, the flakes large and lazy as they drifted down through the bare branches. Wind picking up by afternoon, rattling the shutters, sending drafts through every crack. Visibility dropping by evening, the world beyond the windows fading to a gray blur. The people of the valley had seen winters before. They had seen blizzards. They thought they knew what was coming. They did not. By midnight of the first day, the temperature had dropped to 35 degrees below zero. Oh, the wind was gusting to 70 miles per hour, driving snow horizontal, turning each flake into a needle of ice that could draw blood from exposed skin in seconds. The sound of it was like nothing anyone had heard before. A howling that never stopped, a roaring that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the sky itself were screaming. Old Ezra Boone, who had lived in these mountains for 78 years, who had seen storms that killed cattle in their barns and men in their beds, stood at his window and watched the sky with ancient eyes. "This one," he said to no one, his voice barely audible above the wind. "This one is different." By the second day, 3 people had frozen to death in the valley below. A man named Harrison, who had gone to check on his livestock and lost his way in the white void between his house and his barn. 70 feet. That was how far he made it. They found him 3 months later when the snow melted, 70 feet from his door, his hand reaching toward home. By the third day, roofs were collapsing under the weight of accumulated snow. The temperature had dropped to 42 below zero. Frostbite could set in within 3 minutes of exposure. People were burning furniture, books, anything that would light. The Great Blizzard of 1866, as it would come to be called, lasted 9 days. 9 days of temperatures that never rose above 20 below zero. 9 days of wind that never dropped below 40 miles per hour. 9 days of snow that fell and fell and fell until the drifts reached the eaves of houses and buried fences and made the world into a white, howling void. 47 people died across 4 counties. Men who went to check on livestock and never returned. Women who ran out of firewood and burned everything they owned before the cold took them anyway. Children who fell asleep and did not wake up. The oldest survivors would talk about it for the rest of their lives. They would tell their grandchildren about the sound of the wind, how it screamed like something alive and hungry. They would describe the cold, how it crept through every crack, how it turned breath to ice before it left your lips, how it made your fingers and toes feel like they belonged to someone else. And they would talk about the widow on the mountain, the one everyone had called mad, the one whose door stayed open when every other door was frozen shut. By the 4th day, the Whitfield farmhouse in Whitesburg lost its roof. A sound like thunder in the night, and then the cold pouring in, relentless, unstoppable, filling the house with a chill that no fire could combat. Phineas Whitfield, his wife Prudence, and everyone else in the house faced a simple equation: stay and freeze, or risk the journey to somewhere safer. There was nowhere safer. Every building in the valley was suffering. The church had taken in a dozen families already, but the church itself was losing the battle against the cold. The wood piles that had seemed adequate in November were depleted now, and there was no way to get more, except for the widow on the mountain. On the 5th day of the storm, Phineas Whitfield stood at the door of his sister's cabin. He had walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow, through wind that tried to push him backward with every step, and through cold so intense it had frozen his beard to his coat. His face was gray. His hands were clawed with incipient frostbite. Behind him stood Prudence, Dr. Aldous Mercer, Reverend Josiah Crane, Virgil Tanner with his hands wrapped in bloody bandages, and 12 others from the valley, including Widow Opal Shelton, who had come not for shelter but to help. Lenora opened the door and looked at them. The wind howled behind them, driving snow into the warm air of the cabin. Steam rose from their frozen clothing as the heat touched it. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Phineas said in a voice that cracked with cold and something else, something harder for him to produce than words, "Lenora, our roof, the roof is gone. We have nowhere else to go." Lenora looked at her brother, this man who had called her inheritance worthless, who had let his wife laugh at her dreams, who had never once, in 3 years of living in his house, treated her as anything other than a burden to be tolerated. Behind her, Thaddeus stood, leaning on his crutch, ready to follow her lead in whatever she decided. Cora watched from the bed, her dark eyes wide. Scout sat at Lenora's feet, looking up at her as if to say, "Well?" Lenora stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "All of you. Come in." They stumbled into the cabin, 23 people in all, filling the small space with the cold they carried on their bodies and the desperate hope they carried in their eyes. The warmth hit them like a physical force. Dr. Mercer, who had told Lenora her system had no scientific basis, stopped in the middle of the room and stood there, his mouth open, tears streaming down his windburned face. "And this is impossible," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "This is not possible." Outside, it was 47 degrees below zero. The wind was still screaming. The snow was still falling. The world was white death in every direction. Inside Lenora's cabin, it was 58 degrees, warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, warm enough to heal, warm enough to live. "The mountain," Lenora said simply, "is breathing." For 9 days, 23 people lived in Lenora's cabin and in the entrance chamber of the cave behind it. They slept in shifts, bodies pressed close for additional warmth, children piled together like puppies, adults taking turns keeping the small, supplemental fire going in the wood stove. Lenora shared her food, her water from the underground spring, her blankets, her space. She asked for nothing in return. On the third night, young Mrs. Agnes Harlow, barely 20 years old and 8 months pregnant when the storm struck, gave birth to a son. Widow Opal Shelton, who had supported Lenora from the beginning, helped deliver the child, her steady hands guiding new life into the warmth of the cave while death raged outside. They named him Thomas, after Lenora's first husband. No one except Lenora knew why she wept when she heard the name. On the 5th night, Willa Henderson, 7 years old, the same age as Cora, stopped shivering for the first time since the storm began. She had been silent for 6 hours, curled into a ball, her eyes fixed on nothing, her body fighting a battle against hypothermia that she had been slowly losing. Scout went to her. The dog pressed his warm body against hers, licked her face, and would not leave her side. The first words she spoke when the color returned to her cheeks were, "Can I pet the dog?" Cora became her guide, led her through the cave to see the crystals, showed her the wonders that Lenora had found. The two girls became inseparable. The storm ended on the 9th day. They emerged from the cave into a world transformed. The snow was higher than their heads in places. The sky was blue and clear and cold, so bright it hurt to look at. They climbed the slope above the cabin, all 23 of them, plus Lenora and Cora and Thaddeus and Scout, and they looked out over the valley below. The destruction was absolute. Roofs collapsed, barns flattened, fences buried. The landscape looked like something had chewed it up and spit it out. 47 people dead, they would later learn, across 4 counties. 47 people who had not found shelter, who had not known that safety was possible, who had not believed the widow on the mountain. Phineas stood before Lenora, his face haggard, aged 10 years and 9 days. "Lenora," he said, his voice breaking, "I owe you an apology." Lenora waited. "I called you a fool," Phineas continued. "I said your inheritance was worthless. I let Prudence mock you. I never once asked what you needed. I never once treated you as anything other than a burden." He looked at the duct emerging from the floor, at the warm air flowing steadily from the earth, at everything he had dismissed as madness. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about everything. I called you mad while you were building the only thing that could save us all." "There is nothing to forgive," Lenora said. "You are here. You are alive. Yeah, that is all that matters." She embraced her brother, and he wept against her shoulder. Dr. Aldous Mercer stepped forward. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice hoarse, "I told you there was no scientific basis for what you were doing. I was wrong. The science was right in front of me. I simply refused to see it." Reverend Josiah Crane stood beside him. "I said this was not the Lord's way," he said quietly. "But perhaps the Lord's ways include giving wisdom to those who pay attention. What you have built here is not witchcraft. It is a miracle of understanding." Virgil Tanner pushed through the crowd. His right hand was wrapped in bandages, 2 fingers lost to frostbite during his attempt to reach the woodpile on the second day of the storm. "I bet $5 you would die up here," he said. His voice cracked. "Now I owe you everything. My life, my fingers. Everything I still have, I have because you opened that door." Even Prudence, who had laughed at Lenora's inheritance, who had mocked her dreams, stood with tears streaming down her face. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I was cruel to you, and you saved my life anyway." Cornelius Blackwood stood at the back of the crowd, silent. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge his threats, his attempts to take the land. He simply looked at Lenora for a long moment and then turned and walked away down the mountain. He would never return to Harlan County. Lenora did not need his apology. Her victory needed no recognition from those who had tried to take what was hers. Take a moment now. Think about the people in your life who doubted you. Think about the times you were told you were wrong, that you did not know what you were doing, that you should give up. And think about this. Lenora did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply opened her door and let them in. What would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. In the spring of 1866, Lenora Whitfield and Thaddeus Brennan were married in a small ceremony at the mouth of the cave. Old Ezra Boone served as witness. Cora stood as her mother's attendant, wearing a dress that Opal Shelton had sewn from fabric traded at the Crossroads store. Scout sat solemnly beside the couple, as though he understood the importance of the occasion. Reverend Josiah Crane performed the ceremony, the same man who had warned Lenora that living in the earth was not the Lord's way. "I have seen," he said, looking at the crystal chamber glittering behind them, "that the Lord's ways are more various than I knew. What you have built here, Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Brennan, is not unholy. It is a testament to the wisdom that God gives to those who pay attention." They exchanged rings, simple bands of silver that Thaddeus had forged himself, working at the small anvil he had set up beside the cabin, and they began their life together. The years that followed were the full, productive years that come to those who have earned them. The cave tours began in the autumn of 1866. $2 per person, small groups only, no touching the formations, no taking samples, no open flames beyond the oil lamps that Lenora provided. Virgil Tanner, the young man who had bet against her, became her first apprentice. He learned to build thermosiphon systems, to read the signs of weather and geology, to understand the hidden structures that made the world work. He would eventually teach others, and they would teach others, and the knowledge would spread like ripples in a pond. Lenora corresponded with Professor Nathaniel Warren at Harvard, who became fascinated by her detailed observations of the cave and the thermosiphon system she had created. Her letters, precise and technical and humble, earned her something she had never sought: respect from men of science who had no idea they were corresponding with a woman until they learned, and who continued corresponding anyway, because her observations were too valuable to dismiss. Thaddeus's leg healed, though he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He never complained about it. He said it was a small price to pay for what he had found on that mountain. They had 2 more children, a boy named Thomas, after Lenora's first husband, born in 1868, a girl named Miriam, after the aunt who had started everything, born in 1871. The children grew like the hemlocks along the creek, rooted in the hollow, shaped by the place. Cora learned everything her mother knew. She could read the weather in the way Scout held his ears. She could calculate heat loss through a wall by pressing her palm against it. She understood in a way that went deeper than words, that knowledge was not something you kept, but something you gave away. She married Dr. William Harlow, a young physician from Pineville who had come to study the strange heating system that everyone in the medical community was talking about. He stayed for the science. He stayed longer for Cora. Thomas Jr. had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's gray-green eyes. He was quiet, like Lenora. Watchful. He would sit for hours in the crystal chamber, sketching the formations, mapping their growth patterns, adding to the journals his mother had kept since the beginning. He became a geologist, studied at the University of Kentucky, wrote papers about cave formation and karst hydrology that were cited in textbooks for decades. But he always came home to the hollow. Always. Miriam, the youngest, had a gift for people that neither of her parents possessed. She could talk to anyone, could make the most suspicious visitor feel welcome, could explain the science of the cave in words that made children's eyes go wide with wonder. She never married. She said she was already married to the mountain. And by 1890, the cave tours had become a modest institution, 3 generations of the family working together. Lenora, white-haired now, still leading the occasional tour for visitors who specifically requested her. Thaddeus maintaining the heating system with hands that had grown stiff but never lost their precision. Cora managing the correspondence. Thomas conducting scientific surveys. Miriam greeting guests and telling stories. In 1879, a letter arrived from Whitesburg. It was written in cramped handwriting on cheap paper, the words short and strained, hovering between pride and desperation. Phineas had lost the farm. A series of misfortunes, he wrote, as though they were things that had happened to him rather than consequences of choices he had made. Bad harvests. A mortgage with usurious terms. A lawsuit over a property boundary that had dragged through the courts and consumed everything. He did not ask for money directly. He did not apologize for the past. The very act of writing was apology enough. Lenora sent $50, a substantial sum, more than a month's income from the cave tours, and she sent an invitation. "Come to the mountains," she wrote. "There is room for you here." Phineas came. He was a different man than the one who had mocked her at the supper table 14 years before. Quieter, humbler. The certainty had been worn out of him by years of watching his predictions fail. He lived in the hollow for the rest of his life. He helped with the tours. He learned to maintain the heating system. He never again questioned his sister's judgment about anything. He died in the spring of 1882, and then they buried him on the hillside above the cabin, beside the spot where Scout had been laid to rest 4 years earlier. Scout. The dog who had been waiting on the cabin porch when they arrived, starving and loyal, somehow knowing that someone would come. The dog who had followed Lenora into the cave that first time, who had sat beside her through every triumph and every setback, who had warmed frightened children with his body during the great storm. He lived to be 14 years old. His muzzle went gray. His legs grew stiff. But every morning, until the very end, he followed Lenora to the mouth of the cave and sat there, watching, guarding, as though protecting this place were the most important work any creature could do. He died on an autumn afternoon in 1878, lying in the sunlight on the cabin porch, one in the exact spot where Lenora had first found him. They buried him on the hillside with a stone marker. Scout, it read, the faithful guardian. Lenora wept at his grave, the way you weep for a friend who has been with you through everything. And then she went back to work because that is what Scout would have wanted. That is what he had taught her in his patient, silent way. You keep going. You keep doing the work. That is how you honor what you love. If you have ever loved an animal the way Lenora loved Scout, you know that they are not pets. They are family. They are witnesses to our lives. They are the ones who love us without condition and without judgment. Take a moment to remember the animals who have been part of your story. I would love to hear about them in the comments. The years continued to pass. Lenora's hair went gray, then white. Her hands, which had built and shaped and measured for nearly 30 years, grew thickened with arthritis that made the fine work painful, but not impossible. She still walked into the cave every morning, lamp in hand, moving through the passages with the unhurried familiarity of a man walking through his own home, which in every sense that mattered, it was. In 1890, the cave was listed in national guidebooks as one of the most remarkable crystal caverns in the eastern United States. Visitors came from Louisville, from Cincinnati, from as far away as New York. Lenora refused every offer to commercialize the cave. A Cincinnati businessman wanted to install electric lighting and build a hotel. She declined. A mining company wanted to extract the crystals and sell them. She refused. Could a railroad wanted to build a spur line to bring more tourists? She said no. The cave is not a commodity, she told them all. It is a trust. In February of 1897, Lenora Whitfield Brennan caught pneumonia. She had been outside checking the air channels after a heavy snowfall, making sure the vents were clear, when a cold rain caught her halfway up the slope. She was 63 years old, and the illness took hold that night and refused to release its grip. For 3 weeks, Thaddeus nursed her with the same patient competence she had shown when he lay recovering from the cave-in 30 years before. Cora came from Pineville. Thomas and Miriam came from their homes in the valley. The grandchildren gathered, filling the cabin with the sounds of young life. The room was warm. It was always warm. The earth breathed through the channels Lenora had built, steady and patient, keeping the temperature at 62 degrees while ice coated the branches outside the window. On her last lucid day, Lenora asked Cora to bring her something from the cave, a crystal, a small one, from the chamber where it had all begun. Cora went into the darkness alone. She chose carefully, a single crystal, perhaps 3 inches long, clear as water with a faint amber warmth at its center. The only time in 30 years that anyone had removed a formation from that protected place. She brought it to her mother. Lenora held it in her palm, turning it in the lamplight. Her hand trembled. The crystal caught the flame and scattered it in bright points across the bedroom ceiling. Stars reflected in still water, a galaxy contained in a piece of stone. As she looked at it for a long time, and her expression was not one of farewell, but of recognition. As though she were seeing in this small piece of stone the same thing she had seen on that first night in the crystal chamber, so many years ago. The evidence of a patience and a process vaster than any human life, and the knowledge that such things exist whether or not anyone is there to see them. She looked at her family, Thaddeus, white-haired now, still holding her hand after all these years. Cora, middle-aged with her father's eyes. Thomas and Miriam, the children of her second chance. The grandchildren watching with the solemn attention of the young. There is always more to find, she said. Those were the last words her family heard her speak. She died as the light was failing outside the window, with the sky turning the color of old silver above the ridge. Thaddeus held her hand. The mountain breathed, and the warmth in the room did not change, would not change, because the source of it was not a fire that could go out, but the earth itself, which does not tire, and does not grieve, and does not stop giving what it has always given. They buried her on the hillside above the hollow, beside Phineas, beside Scout. The stone was simple, local limestone cut from the bluff beside the mine entrance where it had all begun. Lenora Whitfield Brennan, 1834 to 1897. She looked deeper. The cave remained in the family for 3 more generations. Cora's grandchildren donated the property to the state of Kentucky in 1962. It was incorporated into a nature preserve, protected by law from the commercial development that had consumed many of the region's other caves. In 1978, the Crystal Chamber, now formally designated the Whitfield Crystal Room, received National Natural Landmark status. Geologists who studied it estimated that the largest formations were between 12 and 15 million years old, grown molecule by molecule in the silence and darkness of the sealed cave. Each crystal a record of water and mineral and time, written in a language older than speech. In 1985, a team from the University of Kentucky published a study of the heating system Lenora had built. They called it one of the earliest and most sophisticated examples of passive earth-coupled climate control in American residential construction. The efficiency, they noted, rivaled modern geothermal systems, and the engineering principles were sound. The execution was remarkable. They did not know that the woman who built it had no formal education, that she had learned from a clockmaker father and a shelf of borrowed books, that she had been called mad, been called a witch, been told by men with degrees that what she was doing had no scientific basis. They only knew that it worked, and that it had been working for more than a century. The house still stands. The geothermal heating system, upgraded with modern materials but operating on the same convection principles Lenora devised in 1865, is studied annually by engineering students from across the state. The dampers still work. The channels still carry the mountain's breath on the coldest winter nights, and the house maintains its temperature with the quiet reliability that was Lenora's signature in everything she built. Not dramatic, not showy, just utterly dependable. The oak door, the one Lenora found sealed in the mine tunnel, its hand-forged hinges set into chiseled limestone by Aunt Miriam nearly 2 centuries ago, hangs in its original frame. A placard installed by the Park Service reads, "Original mine door, circa 1795. Sealed a natural cave passage for approximately 70 years before discovery by Lenora Whitfield in 1865. Beyond the door, the cave breathes. Warm air moves through the passages in its ancient rhythm, rising and falling with atmospheric pressure that the stone translates into motion as naturally as a lung translates nerve signals into breath. Water seeps through the limestone overhead, carrying its dissolved cargo of calcium, depositing it crystal by crystal on formations that were old before any human walked the continent above. The pool in the crystal chamber is still as glass. The crystals bloom on their dark walls. Nothing has changed in there. Nothing needs to. The earth keeps its own time. It does not hurry. It does not rest. It builds crystal by crystal, layer by layer, in the darkness where no eye sees and no hand touches. Building something beautiful for no reason except that the conditions are right in the process, once begun, does not stop. We have come to the end of Lenora's story. But before you go, I want to leave you with a question. What sealed door in your life is waiting to be opened? What knowledge do you carry that others do not understand? What would happen if you stopped listening to the people who call you foolish and started listening to what you know is true? Lenora was told she was mad. She was told she would fail. She was told that what she was building was impossible. She built it anyway. And when the storm came, when everything else collapsed, her door was the one that stayed open. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me about the doors you have opened or the ones you are still afraid to try. I read every comment and I would love to hear your story. Until next time, remember, there is always more to find. The end.